My name is Devin. I am the Director of Debate at Cal State Long Beach. So if y'all want to debate in college, you could possibly apply there. There's a few of your lab leaders that are actual debaters on our team right now, but yeah. So today I'm going to be talking to you about non-traditional / critical apps and how to construct them for the most part. I've tried to not delve too much into the topic on this because I know that there's going to be more lectures about some of the topical things that are going to be discussed, but yeah. So, let's start. So, performance debate or just critical debate in general is any debate style or content that differs from the traditional policy analysis, calculation of cost-benefit analysis, right? Anything that deals particularly with enacting a USFG plan, right? Not to say that all forms of these performative or critical debates don't do that, but for the most part, they kind of shy away from it, or it's just really symbolic if they do have a plan, okay? And so usually this debate is all about debating the political consequences of what happens as a result of what's in a resolution, as well as what might happen in the room itself as debaters. Okay? And one of the things that I really want y'all to understand is that you should not ever divorce your relationship from the topic or from the resolution. Even when doing non-traditional or critical forms or performative forms of debate, you should always figure out how to link it to the topic in some form or fashion. Because oftentimes, if you don't do that, you're going to lose the framework in T more often than not, okay? Unless you have some really outstanding reason why you are not engaging in a resolution. And so I think some of the words in a resolution that can really be played with: fiscal redistribution, federal jobs guarantee, Social Security, providing basic income. These are key words that people will have to, critically or performatively engage in order to make this particular act become possible. So some of the ways in which we do this is composed of embodied critical arguments, personal identity / narratives, performance and stylistic choices, and I'm going to, at the last part, talk about running these particular things, okay? So, when we think about the performance debate in itself, there are several elements that go into what we will question, what we will criticize, and things that will allow us to have more of a free flow of consciousness about how to address certain conditions that exist from the resolution. The first one, we look at political consequences. This is a broad term that can include discursive and symbolic political meanings, and the way that you engage debate itself can be positive or negative, right? And it could be, particular actions that are taken as a result of the resolution. Another thing, actions and inactions, is more concerned with not only what is said in debate or the totality or the ideology of what happens in the debate round, or what particular things could have been rhetorically said that might be a little bit racist, sexist, homophobic, or any of those isms that exist, right? Because some of these styles of debate will call out some of the rhetorical mechanisms that have caused some of the rhetorical violence that might happen in the round. And the last thing is debaters in the room. All debaters are performing, right? It doesn't matter if people want to see themselves as performance debaters. Everyone is performing in the round. And so these performances will implicate them in a system of oppression or dominance in some form or fashion, or you can understand that you could be complicit in those things or trying to challenge those things. And so we want to also think about what are the things that are being ignored within the topic or in the resolution, especially if you're affirmative. Because on face, the resolution sounds like a really good action to take for many people that have suffered through not having fiscal reliability or stability. However, there could be a dark side to some of those things, or historical elements or foundations that have made it so that they are not as positive as they may seem. Okay? So, next thing, performance theory in itself is concerned with unveiling subjugated knowledge of how the body performs itself in certain environments, and this definitely deals with debate and how we perform ourselves in debate. But this idea comes from a lot of communication and performance studies, where we do have to understand that the way that we are performing ourselves on a daily basis has consequences on how we make political choices. Okay? A performance team as some people have isolated themselves. This is a team that deploys stylistic choices that are not as normative to traditional understandings, and they attempt to employ their body as a form of politics or the experiences that they have, right? This is not all of performance debaters, but it is one aspect of it, okay? And so you oftentimes will try to claim advantages off of this performance that you do, because I think that oftentimes people will just read a poem or do something that's performative and it just stops there. You're supposed to also incorporate that into the 2AC, the 1AR, and so on. And the way that you would do that is being able to extend your logic or understanding of those arguments in a way that is strategic and also incorporates the debate space in mind, right? You have to have an interpretation of what the debate space means and why you're debating in it and the way that you're debating. Because you can't just be like, oh, I'm just performing to be performing. That doesn't make any sense. You have to have a reason why this space is important and why this space is key in order to do your particular strategy. Okay. So, the next thing, critical asks. So these are affirmatives that usually might have a plain text, might not, right? But the critical components of it will be tied to some type of theory of power. Does anybody know what I mean by theory of power? What does that mean? Anybody heard this term before? Yes.
It's like when you say how the world is shaped by. So for example, commonly it's like capitalism.
Yes, exactly. Your theory of power is what is the thing that you structurally believe society or civil society or modernity is structured by, and how you're going to view impacts and the way that you analyze arguments through that system of power. And this is not to say that you only have to have one, but it becomes a little bit easier to have one and try to argue how that structurally engages with other forms of oppression, right? So some theories of power that exist, like the student said, capitalism, right? There's also neoliberalism, patriarchy, heteronormativity, anti-blackness. Those are all theories of power that people have used commonly in debate to describe where they have oriented their performative politics, okay? Or how they want to address the resolution. Now the other thing too is that when you read a critical AF, you don't necessarily have to perform anything, right? Because it's just a critical affirmative. You just get to read cards about some critical elements and criticisms of the topic. That's pretty much it. But, you know, strategically, sometimes people will put a plan that is oftentimes just symbolic, or sometimes they will literally do the plan, but only in situations where it is strategic. Because sometimes people will have a plan there, and they'll go against a critical team, and the critical team will be like, oh, you still embrace the United States federal government. And they're like, actually not, it's just symbolic. Doesn't mean we're actually embracing them. And the actual, consequentialism that goes along with that plan. Or if they go against a team that is a little bit more straight up, they might be like, yeah, I am going to affirm this plan. And then so that team will get up and read a bunch of diss-ads and blah, 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 right? And what do we think happens when a team reads diss-ads against a critical AF? How does the affirmative answer those things? Yes?
This says that, oh, well, we don't agree with the resolution, so you can't select the disadvantage is invalid.
Close, yes. What else? What do we think? Yes.
Critical affirmatives won't necessarily follow like the same framework as like a disadvantage with like utilitarian like impacts or like the sort of like procedural policy framework that goes through like the disadvantage.
Mm-hmm. Yes. What else?
Oh no.
Okay. All right. Anybody else? Yes, that was mostly right? Because the thing is that if you're a critical AF, you might want to impact turn maybe those diss-ads, if that is a thing, or also criticize the disadvantage and the logic behind it. Because oftentimes, depending on which theory of power that you're utilizing, you can use that theory of power to criticize the implications of the disadvantage. For example, if you're reading a AF that is based in criticizing the neoliberal approach to jobs guarantees, and someone reads a diss-ad, you can be like, well, actually, your diss-ad is complicit within the system of neoliberalism, which makes it worse. And we need to also question how you framed and created this narrative of a diss-ad that has neoliberal backings, right? So you want to criticize they're disads from your theory of power. That's why it's very important for you to have one or a couple of them. Or even if it's not a theory of power that you're advocating for, you can still use it to answer the disad, and you definitely have to do a lot of impact work. Okay, so one of the examples that I thought from the topic would be interesting is, I could symbolically or literally question the assumptions behind the list of the subtopics, right? So you could say that like stuff like Social Security or job guarantees or the basic income increases the likelihood of biopolitics, right? And this is a Foucauldian term, which is this person here, right? And biopolitics is just a way that the government can control life and has a level of social control over its citizens or residents, right? And so what happens is that if we start to give you these things to make your life better, we're going to want something in return. It's going to be like, you're going to have to give up something or do something for us in order to make sure that you still get access to this job guarantee or this basic income or this Social Security, right? Because there's definitely stipulations that go into having certain guarantees or things that come from the government. Yes?
So as a critical av, you essentially just spend your time critiquing the resolution / theory of power involved in it.
Part of it, yes. A big chunk of it, yes. I would say 45%, because the other part is defending that you're even able to do it, as well as what do you do? Like, what does this performance mean and why is it good? Why is it epistemologically good for the debate space in itself for you to talk about this stuff? What is epistemology? Anybody tell me? Yes. Yes.
It's the philosophical study of knowledge.
Yes, right? And so when I say epistemological in a lot of these things, what I'm saying is that you have to criticize the epistemology that is rooted in the topic. The topic in itself on face seems to be very positive. It seems to be a good action that the government can take. But what is behind those actions? What is behind this basic income? What are the stipulations? What, if we expand Social Security, how do we start to widen the net to make it so that we can start controlling people a lot more, right? And that's the thing. And so there's another thing. You can reject some of the logic of capitalism and neoliberal assumptions that indoctrinate people into the workforce. And also, I kind of said this already about the requirements that could be put on basic income. Because as of right now, I think a way that people are going to debate this is they're going to say, oh, we just give a basic income. It's going to change the racial gap of wealth and how that stuff happens, right? But when you think about that in itself, how exactly do you passing a policy change this racial wealth gap when it's not just about the economics, but there's also some social activity and some valuing process that goes along with the bodies that have been excluded within that notion that is at play. So it's not just policy level things that excluded black and brown and other people of color from these particular systems, but there's also probably an unexplained libidinal drive to do that. And so some people will advocate for that. Okay? So when we think about embodied critical arguments, this is literally where teams will do stuff that perform their bodies more. In a sense, some of these are examples, this is not all of them, right? And this is teams will take a political stance on a topic or perform how it may look for them, poetry, rapping, cultural or social narratives, right? Or using K to change it into more of an embodied approach. So some folks might look at a patriarchy criticism and might want to perform something that is a challenge against the narratives of patriarchy, right? Poetry is definitely a thing that exists in debate in a very heavy way. But I do think that when we're talking about using poetry in debate, you should not just do it and just read it to be reading it. That poetry must be loaded with things you can weaponize against the other side. Bless you. It should be loaded with things that you can weaponize against the other side. It should be answers of framework in your poetry. There should be answers to why the debate space is key inside your poetry. There should be all of these hidden things. You don't have to directly say them, but at least have them inside of it that you can manipulate it when it occurs, right? Rapping, a lot of people have not done this as much in recent times, but it was definitely a big thing several years ago when a lot of people saw like the popularity of Oklahoma's George and Rashid that would do a lot of the rapping. Social and cultural narratives are definitely something that is very important because there will be folks that have an experience with some of the things that you're talking about, or you could have lived experience with the things that are in the resolution, or your parents or people that are close to you, and those narratives could be something that could be shared if that is something that is consensual and it's like what you want to do. But those particular narratives can talk about a lot of the historical foundations of how Social Security, access to job or employment discrimination have been ways in which to disavow people of color, right? And that could be a thing that you talk about, but it's up to you. Okay. So, some of the more critical arguments. I'm going to start here. Critical race theory is literally one of the main forms of race theory that is going to criticize a lot of things in this topic. And so I think that a lot of people like to jump to this one here, this Afro-pessimism, without looking to the backdrop of what created the conditions for Afro-pessimism to exist, which is critical race theory, which it started as a criticism of law and then it moved into criticizing education systems and how we teach students and how we also teach law students as well to think about the law as this neutral place, or thinking of education as a neutral place when we know that education is never neutral, as we see what's happening all over the country outside of California, in places like Texas, Florida, and any other places in the South, right? And so critical race theory will definitely have a criticism of how we think about Social Security and its foundations historically, which are not the best, because we'll get into that in a second. But yeah, but when we think about Afro-pessimism, of course there will definitely be a criticism of the topic on this level as well, or you can apply criticisms of Afro-pessimism. And so of course, some of you might have read these arguments before that talk specifically about the theory of power that utilizes anti-black racism as a central starting point. And so when thinking about that, this particular theory of power is going to address how black people have been situated in society based on those three aspects of the topic. Because what I will say, black people are kind of the reason in a lot of cases why the controversies within the resolution exist the way that they are, right? Especially from the foundations of jobs and Social Security in itself, which was kind of handed down to us by the New Deal, FDR during that time, right? And so when we think a little bit more fast track to the future under the Reagan administration, we see that this is a time in the 80s when, you know, I was just being born, a lot of you were not born yet, but the thing is Reagan started to weaponize the identity of black women through saying that women that were collecting social services or welfare were seen as the welfare queen. And so this trope was something that was used to weaponize and say that black people were lazy, particularly black women became, you know, vessels of producing children so they can get more checks from the government, which is definitely a misconstruing of that process. And so what they used is the depiction of this woman here, Linda Taylor, in order to say that, you know, these black women are in the hood and they're just collecting these checks and they're buying their Cadillacs and not taking care of their kids, and they're very promiscuous. They want to make more babies so that they can actually get more money from the government, right? And that's what led to a lot of the cutting and slashing of cash payments and even other forms of benefits that you get from the government. It's because of the weaponization of this image of black women, okay? And so what I will say is that there are some scholars that might say you could affirm the identity of the welfare queen, right? And to say that this is a trope that has been weaponized against black women, but we're reclaiming it as a way to say that black women shouldn't have to be productive under the state, or they shouldn't have to do things that are held to traditional conventions of womanhood and sexuality, right? And it's funny because somebody actually was asking me about this particular concept, and they created a whole affirmative already that talks about the welfare queen and affirming the welfare queen as an identity to refuse to be productive to the state. and to engage in criminality as a method to fight back against the alleged productivity of the resolution. So, could be a thing, right? And I think that this can similarly be situated when it comes to other women from other racial groups, especially Latinx women, right? Or anyone that has been criminalized under the idea of collecting social services, right? And then even there's definitely tropes that exist out there and stereotypes of different groups of women that can be utilized for this. Doesn't have to be the welfare queen, because this is usually a trope that is connected to Black women's identity, which is very problematic. But in some ways you can reclaim those things and say that that's something that we are throwing into the face of the United States federal government to say that you wanted to say this is what we are and this is what we're going to be, and we're going to steal from you and take away from your academy, stuff like that. Up to whoever wants to do that, but that's just one idea. So, when you think about Social Security, more historically, right, there's definitely certain populations that are excluded from the Social Security system, right? And even historically, when the Social Security Act was passed, it was definitely racially coded because it excluded agricultural workers and domestic workers, which during the early times of that era, who were the most of the population that were doing domestic and agricultural work during the New Deal era?
People of color.
Yeah, but there's more specific group of people. Yeah, sorry.
Latin Americans and Filipinos.
Ooh, not yet.
Black people.
Black people. Yes. And so the reason why they kind of excluded these social service benefits is because for domestic and agricultural workers, because at that time it was mostly saturated with Black people, right? And so they felt that if they did this and they incorporated it, it would take away Black people's labor from those particular areas so they can get and collect benefits from other places. And so this is why when we think of the Social Security Act in itself, when it was initially brought about, it was racially coded and it was trying to exclude certain people in the nation. Now, of course, that had definitely the effect to exclude other people of color as folks were starting to migrate here, and that became a thing. And even when you think about in modern day society, undocumented immigrants and residents cannot collect Social Security benefits. And so when we think about that as a situation, I'm not really sure if there's going to be an affirmative that advocates for that to be a thing, but there are consequences for if that was to be a thing. Because if you start collecting Social Security and you're undocumented, what is the risk that exists there?
You get deported.
Yeah, I mean, also it creates a more of a biopolitical control of this population because it's able to track and know where you are and to see how long they can collect certain things from you and then probably deport you, right? And so this becomes a very important thing we have to look at, is that these things look seemingly neutral and okay as a topic, but there could be negative offshoots for certain people. The other thing too to think about with this jobs guarantee, employment discrimination still exists. I don't think that if you say, oh, you have a guaranteed job, that automatically employment discrimination goes away. It doesn't. And also historically, when we think about Social Security as this modern day facets have come into play, a lot of folks definitely get excluded based on socioeconomic status as well, like as race and gender and things of that nature, because when we think about life expectancy and who gets the benefits of Social Security, oftentimes Black people are, and other people of color have a lower life expectancy than white folks. So it's just like the payouts for that don't always become even. And even when we think about working in general, the livelihood of, or longevity of Black people working versus other people of color and white folks, it becomes a lot more stagnant when we think about access to the job market. So if you don't really have a job that pays into Social Security, you're probably not going to get the benefits that exist in that particular situation. But the other thing too is that even amongst highly educated men, Black people in this category get a return of only 82 cents on the dollar they invest, while white folks get 90 cents. Okay, it might not seem like a lot, but it is. in the long run when you think about years compiled on top of that. So I think an affirmative that really criticizes a lot of the Social Security and how it historically has been created and manipulated in a particular way to benefit certain people is something that's very valid. But what I will say about all these topics is that you want to read literature about it. Don't just get up and think you just talk about these things and not be well read about it, because I feel like that's really a problem of high school students today, is that, you know, your coach hands you some critical app and they say go read it, and you don't have any context or historical basis of what this means. And I think that you need to look up these concepts before you start just going into it. I mean, I get that there's critical authors that might criticize these things, but you want to go back to the original text of what the thing they're criticizing in order to make sure that you understand what that criticism is and how to explain it for yourself. Okay? So, personal identity. Now, of course, debaters can engage in utilizing personal narratives or experiences that are unique to themselves, right? In order to engage in some type of performative or cultural identity performance thing, right? And so there could be a criticism of debate that you could do inside of this. Debate structure is deeply rooted in a rhetoric of neoliberal progress that favors styles of debate that function as a means, supposed to be means, to fuel the welfare state of exploitation, right? You can play with the words in a resolution, especially redistribution or fiscal or other things that you might want to say, like if debate is like a job, or if debate is supposed to guarantee like a basic income, but those things are like not equally suited across different debate styles or even different debate communities, right? And how funding for those particular programs are different as well. So fiscal redistribution, in the sense of how we even fund debate, becomes a thing as well that you can use metaphors or analogies to. And so I think that as about debate, if you're going to use a metaphor or an analogy, you want to make sure that those things have some really good grounding and you can explain how those connections can be drawn. And so another thing with using personal identity, please make sure that it is rooted in one of the aspects that come from the resolution, and you're just not getting up and just randomly talking about personal experience if it's not connected to some level of theory of power as well as a criticism of the topic. That has to be the main aspect that you're utilizing when you talk about these particular things. Okay? And also remember, I'm going to post this onto the Discord after we're done, so if I'm clicking too fast or whatever, you'll see it again. All right, and it's also being recorded, so it's okay. So here is just a semi-exhaustive list of some of the things that you can do as performances in the debate. I've mentioned some of these things before, right? And so all of these are fair game. And all these things have actually been done in debate already, but it's always about practicing and trying to understand what these things mean in reference to the stuff that you are going to try to perform in debate, and just don't do it to just be doing it. You have to have some type of political or educational reason why you're embracing a particular performance style that you are, and that has to be something that you're going to gain some level of advantage off of later in the debate. The 2AC should never forget about any of the performances that were done. I also think that like when you're doing performance styles of debate, you don't have to keep performing like the actual stuff that you're talking about throughout the 2AC and the 1AR. You don't have to, some people might, but it oftentimes takes away from you being able to answer arguments or to be able to fit the stuff that they said into your stuff. Because at the point of this type of debate, the 1AC should be the literal artifact or performative like statement that was done that you're going to be analyzing throughout the debate to say that is a good form of knowledge production or whatever your particular stance will be. And I think that is something that you need to focus on instead of trying to perform a particular performance in the 2AC or later on in the debate. You have to make the performance and then utilize that performance throughout, not keep creating new performances because you don't have a whole lot of time for that. So whichever one of these or mixture of these that you choose to utilize, you want to make sure you practice it and that you understand the depth and nuance that goes into it. Okay? So, here is what can go inside of a critical or performance-based app. This don't have to be in a particular order, but they definitely should be things that are included inside of this affirmative. So, first thing, of course, is the philosophical backing, which is AKA your theory of power, because you cannot have some just performance or critical act that is not based in some form of theory of power, because in that theory of power, there's going to be literature that you should use to answer some of the arguments that people are going to say against you, especially framework. Right? Because framework, as you'll hear later on from Jason, is something that is going to be a major tool that people will use against these types of affirmatives, because they're just like, I don't know how to engage this stuff. Framework, you're not doing the game right? And so you have to be able to criticize their understanding of framework from your theory of power, and also give legitimate reasons why the education that you're producing is something not necessarily better, but something that should be exposed and utilized because of your social location, or because the location of folks in the debate, or it could be a certain knowledge that has been suppressed, or it's not being seen as something that is credible or valuable, and you think that it should be something that we talk about. The next thing, of course, you need to have some type of advocacy statement, which is literally what should we be doing with your stuff that you presented. Like, why is it that you have produced this form of scholarship? Is it because you're trying to challenge some type of ism? Are you defending a particular artifact or performance? Are you saying that we should affirm something? Like I said earlier, like people are now starting to think about ways to how to affirm the welfare queen, right? And so those are things that you should think about, and how you're going to affirm that and make it something that has advantages and ways that you can offensively use it against framework and other forms of theory of power. Because, like, let's not be fooled, framework is not the only thing that people will read against you. They'll read another theory of power that they'll say is competitive and a much better way to explain the world outside of the one that you've isolated. Okay? Oftentimes people will start to use more of a role of the ballot or role of the judge / framework. All three of these are very different in the way that they're utilized, but some people have now put inside their judge of philosophies what they want their role to be known as, or like they want you to tell them what their role is, which is, I think, is a little bit interesting. But you should definitely have an understanding of what you want your judge's role to be. I mean, because honestly, when people tell me to roll the judge, I'm like, I'm gonna do what I want. Like, I don't really care what your role of the judge is, but that's the thing. But I do think that a role of the ballot, or what the ballot means, is something that you should definitely have as a way to describe stuff. And I can already see now, there could be some people that might read some reparations arguments and be like, hey, the ballot is a form of fiscal redistribution and reparative justice for, XYZ, anti-blackness, or whatever. Right? That could be a thing that is said. I really think it is, because this resolution doesn't really give like a whole lot of wiggle room for you to embrace reparations as a thing that black folks should demand based on some of the stuff that Afro-pessimism is talking about. But the thing is that whatever you interpret that ballot to be, it has to be something that you're willing to defend, and you have to be able to answer it being self-serving, because that's one of the major arguments that people are going to say is that your role of the ballot is self-serving and doesn't do anything. But you want to be able to defend why it is not, and why it is a good tool to redistribute some justice and fiscal stuff, I guess. Okay? And of course, your framework is just how are we going to orient impacts, or how we're going to describe what should be prioritized, right? Some of you talked about utilitarianism, consequentialism, things like that. Some folks would like to use deontology, or they can use some type of statement that comes from their theory of power to talk about how we should frame impacts. But you definitely need that, because in a lot of ways, people are going to say, a different type of framework, which might not incorporate yours, or it might. But the thing is that they're saying you should prioritize their framework as opposed to yours. But framework debating is definitely important. Y'all will get 2 lectures about that pretty soon. And those things are very important for you to have an understanding of, because you can win the content of your arguments all day long. But if you can't win that they actually should have a framing and should be seen as valuable, or should be forefronted or prioritized, then you lose the debate. That's kind of what happens. definitely need to have an impact, or what we structure society on. And so, of course, you already have this theory of power, which should correlate to your impact. But don't want to just say the impact is anti-blackness, judge. No, you want to talk about what is it that anti-blackness produces as material consequences for certain people, or heteronormativity. What is the material consequences that it produces for people that are subject to it? Or what is the material consequences of ableism and how that is something that could possibly come into play when we think about jobs guarantees? Could be a thing. And Social Security, because, there are a lot of people that, I don't say people are disabled, but people that have accessibility needs or people that might have disabilities. I think that becomes one of the major controversies under the Social Security expansion, but that's for whatever the debaters that want to advocate that would be for, okay? Transphobia is another thing that could definitely exist in this topic, because in a lot of ways, laws are being passed to stop certain folks from being able to have certain gender affirming care. And that would definitely be something that comes up in this topic, I would think, especially when we think about employment discrimination and certain markets that folks that are trans get pushed into. And so I think outside of the impacts and all the things that are discussed here, you definitely want to have some preempts that exist in your affirmative. And what I mean by that is that you already want to preempt that someone's going to say capitalism is a root cause, or that anthropocentrism is a root cause. Like whatever it is, there's going to be somebody that after a while, you're going to accumulate knowledge about what are the things that people are going to say against my affirmative, and you have to have some embedded preempts inside of your affirmative that already answers that. Sometimes that can be done through your poetry, sometimes it can be done through cards. Whichever mechanism you want to use, I think there should be some preempts, because it makes it less time that who has to use to prep. Who gets to have less time to prep if you already have preempts inside of your 1AC?
You.
No, who else?
Judge.
If I'm the 1AC and
The
I've already
2AC.
the 2AC, right? The 2AC can have less time to prep because the 1AC has already included embedded answers to the stuff that people are going to say against you, right? So you definitely want to do that. Okay? And so this is kind of like a little bit of the roadmap of the elements that should go inside of your critical AF. However you arrange it is up to you, but it has to be very clear and people should understand what that means. Okay? So I would say when you are talking about the 2AC, you definitely want to have an overview of how your affirmative impacts function within society, as sometimes also within debate as well, because some people will start to lose focus and not understand that all these things have consequences. And so you want to have some type of overview that frames the impacts, maybe gives judge instruction about what the judge should do with your impacts or why your form of education is better. Whatever it is, but you want to make sure that that is something that you prioritize. And also in your overview, you want to include what you're criticizing, how your impacts are harmful, and what does that mean for the debate space, ballot / framework. And this should be something that is no longer than a minute and a half, maybe, in the 2AC or 2NC or whichever side you're reading, some type of overview to a KF. But yeah, clearly, sometimes people will read the KF on a negative against that particular subsection. So if your affirmative is like a big criticism of Social Security, oftentimes you can use it as an AFNEG, which means that you can literally read your affirmative on a negative against that, but that's up to you, okay? And so yeah, and so make sure that you have overviews, blocks for all these things. Don't just think that because you've read this affirmative that all these answers are going to magically come to you in a debate. They're not. You have to be very well prepared if you're reading these types of affirmatives, and you cannot ever think that you are done preparing for this, because you're not. Even people in college think that they're well prepared to run certain affirmatives, and they're not. And this is just not something that you should risk losing a round on because you didn't have answers to a certain thing. If you think that there's going to be a place where people can answer you in all these different aspects, you need to make a list of all that stuff and have a block against all of it and be able to understand how your theory of power interacts with it so you can answer it or talk about how you structure that theory of power with yours. Okay? Oh, wrong. All right, so sometimes when we think about that advocacy statement or the way that you're engaging politically with the topic, oftentimes people will utilize one or more of these particular advocacies or strategies or methods in order to say why their stuff is good or what the debate space means for it. So knowledge production and a research model are usually the very general things that people will say because they're like, hey, our affirmative is a good form of knowledge production because of XYZ reason, or my affirmative is a research model that allows for us to understand the world a lot better when it comes to the elements in a topic. Whatever it is, these are some of the things that you have as a example for you to create a different mode of understanding the topic or the aspects within it. Sometimes you can align yourself with a movement or a particular party, and this is for some of you folks that are some commies that want to embrace the, what is that, dual power, all that good stuff, right? It's awesome. Because I feel like under this topic, it is a very unique understanding of how we should embrace and think about different ways of living with a more socialist or orientation towards the topic situation, right? You could talk about how your affirmative creates a new political imaginary, which means that you're reimagining how politics functions or could function, or that another world is possible through the way that you think about your politics, and that the current politics is very calcified and very bad, and it only leads to people of color being put into a system that's still going to exploit them, even though it is supposed to help them, right? Because one of the large criticisms about this topic is that it is definitely a form of gift giving, is that the United States federal government is kind of saying, hey, we messed up, a lot of different groups of people. Let's give you a basic income. Let's give you some jobs. Let's expand Social Security. All these actions have a particular backing of why they became what they are and why we should criticize them in the way that it comes about. Because oftentimes some of those aspects of how we implement those things are not from an intersectional approach. They don't think about race, class, and gender, sexuality, age, ability, all those different things that go into their formulation. And so they oftentimes will think of this very unifocused way of thinking about how we can solve these issues, but they don't look at the multi-layered ways in which people could be excluded based on that. Okay? So this is more about the ballot discussion. I kind of talked about this, but you definitely want to provide 2 or 3 reasons why these roles are key, the role of the ballot or the role of the judge, right? And what does that mean, and why should that person embrace your particular role of the judge, or why we should embrace your role of the ballot. But you want to make sure that you're not trying to convolute stuff and not explaining what these things mean in the context of all the other elements of your affirmative, because this should not be something that is isolated away from the stuff that you're discussing. It should all be integrated in the way that you explain it. This is why it's very important to have your role of the ballot inside of your overview, the way that you explain the impacts and the advocacy of your critical act. So just don't ever just let people just say my role of the ballot and then they're like, well, my counter role of the ballot, right? Because you're not really answering each other. You're just saying here's a role of the ballot, here's a role of the ballot, but not talking about how those things interact with each other or why there is not certain disads to the way that people frame or look at their ballot in an opposite lens. Okay, some things that people have said about the role of the judge is that they should be an ethical educator, or white judges should be like a race trader, or you should be a policymaker, whichever. I don't think the policymaking framework is necessarily something, or a policymaker role of the judge would not be something you want to advocate with this type of affirmative, but it will be something that the other team will say is the role of the judge to be a policymaker. You have to have some offense against that and say why that's bad. Okay. So, when we think about impacts, of course, hopefully y'all know the difference between the major forms of impacts, that there are consequential impacts, and then there are structural ones. And the way that you think about your impact framing should be based on saying that these structural ones are pretty much inroads to this in a particular way. So how do we get structural impacts to interact with consequential ones? What do usually K debaters or people who run the K will say about them? They say they're the what? And my lab should know, we talked about this.
The bridge.
Huh?
The bridge, maybe.
It is a bridge in a sense, but what do you think if we say, hey, colonialism or settler colonialism is a structure that exists, and then we look at these things over here, what do we think we'll say that settler colonialism does to these things here?
It houses those things.
Yes, which means it's a root cause, exactly, right? And so when we think about how we interact with structural analysis when it comes to these consequential impacts, you have to be able to say how those structural things orient or how they make it so that these things have a condition of possibility to even exist, right? And so the reason why global warming occurs could be because of the exploitation and the degradation of the environment based on human-induced things, right? Which could be a mindset that has come from settler colonialism, or it could definitely be from neoliberalism, because you think that markets and business and corporatism is something that should be the guiding practice that saves the world. It's the best democratic way to understand society. But in actuality, when we make things more neoliberal, what we're doing is making it so that we allow for businesses and corporations to privatize certain industries that should be government-centered, right? Or when we think about actions that Donald Trump did when it comes to environment, he made it so that corporations had a lot more easier because he scaled back a lot of the regulations of the EPA. And so that was a neoliberal action that allowed for corporations to do more drilling, more extraction, more exploitation of the environment, and that becomes how we understand some of the root cause framing of how these things come into existence. But there has to be something that you know and get prepared for, because if you don't have a way to explain that, a lot of people will be able to say, nuclear war, that is way something that outweighs anti-blackness, because, nuclear war kills everybody. It's like, okay, yeah, but you gotta have some criticisms or ways that you answer a lot of these impacts back. Okay? Okay. Yeah, so when we also think about arguments that you're going to term, sometimes you don't want to always call it a permutation. Sometimes you want to say it's a synthesis, or use some type of tricky word that doesn't allow people to know what you said was a permutation. Because if you do, then a lot of people have like a lot of offense on you using a permutation, whether that is a theoretical objection or just like a content-based reason why you shouldn't have a perm. Because sometimes people will say, you don't get a perm because you're not a policy act, you don't have advocacy, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, yeah, but if you understand how your theory of power interacts with the negative argument, or how you're the root cause of what that negative argument is saying, or you structure the way that the material impacts of that negative argument does, you can be able to explain it better to say like, hey, these things are not mutually exclusive, or our affirmative already assumes the logic of what your negative argument says, and that becomes a lot better position for you to be in. But the permutation is definitely something that is necessary when you're reading these types of apps. Especially when people use counter advocacies against you, or things that are allegedly a counterclaim, okay? Because sometimes it'll happen. Because sometimes people will find a way to read a counterclaim that is kind of competitive, but you can still perm it. Like my team, Curtis and Diego like to read this abolition democracy counterplan advocacy against critical teams. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but it is still a counter advocacy that has some level of traction with the things that affirmative is saying, and saying that we should have more of a material focus as opposed to a theoretical focus in which the affirmative is talking about. So however you craft that, it's, it works sometimes, okay? Yeah. Okay. So these are some things that you can say against the negative. you could criticize the presentation of the 1NC or the blocks of what they're doing. Particularly sometimes if you've read an AF that is like not spewed down and not like hyper fast, you can say that their presentation of their 1NC is bad or it's ableist or it has some function that is not educational, right? And so most teams that are not performance or critical will read a K argument that is not in line with their framework. And so you need to make some argument about why somebody reading a framework argument and they're talking about settler colonialism against you. It's just like, those logics are quite very different. You need to call them out and say that they've double turned themselves or there's some walking contradiction that's happening right now and say why that is bad. And then what you want to do is to impact that out to say, hey, they can only go for one of these. If they keep talking about this, you know, it's going to be a voting issue. But I don't think that you should not make it a voting issue. It should be something that you constantly stick them with. If you decided to read a framework argument that says United States federal government action, and that's key, and you read settler colonialism, which is a criticism that doesn't even see that the USFG is a legitimate entity in the first place, that's kind of like a bit of a confusing logic there, and we should probably question how you have epistemologically constructed your 1NC or the education that you have crafted there. And so you want to make that some type of disad or voter against them, to not trust them because they could be like the oppressor in concealed face. Okay? And so they'll oftentimes kick out of that argument. So one trick there is that if they go for a framework and they kick out of settler colonialism, what have they pretty much said? You read framework and settler colonialism. You kick out of settler colonialism, you go for framework. What have they said is more important and prioritized?
The vanity of the debate rather than what's an actual issue.
Yes, right? They have literally said framework and the way that we debate that is more important than these indigenous folks. We don't gotta care about them anymore. Kicked, right? And so materially, you should say something about that. It's just like, oh, so indigenous folks are only important insofar as you win the ballot. Interesting. Or sometimes people read framework and anti-blackness together too, which is very interesting. And this is something I told one of my debaters in the room before, is that, hey, homegirl, let's try not to let them read anti-blackness and framework and you not say anything about it, because that is a thing that exists, that you can't be saying United States federal government and then you say that the foundations of that United States federal government is anti-black and terrible and produces all this social death and gratuitous violence against black bodies, but then you say affirm it. That's very interesting. And then you kick out of it. So which means you said pretty much that the black body is very fungible to you. It's something that you can use when it comes to your particular advantage. So you should always punish people for kicking out of arguments that are more structural to go for framework, because that is something that they'll always do, especially with CAP-K. CAP-K and framework are always used together for the most part to go against a performance or critical AF. And once they kick out of the CAP-K, you need to be talking about the particular structural and political and social violence that comes from the system of capitalism that has had a different people that is affected, and say that they've taken advantage of the experiences of those folks by reading this K and then kicking out of it, which means you didn't really care about the labor exploitation that existed in the first place. You just wanted to use it to win a round. And that's what you can criticize them with. Make them be held accountable for their representations of what they did in a round. Okay? That is it. Thank you. So, is there questions? Because I have time for that, I believe. Any questions about stuff? Yes.
Okay, so sorry, I have two questions.
Fine.
So firstly, how would like critical affirmative response to notions of like debate and activism within the debate space like becoming commodified with like a sort of like semio-capitalism?
Inevitable.
Inevitable?
You need to say that's inevitable. It's just like, just because something is commodifiable doesn't mean that it's not worth the risk of trying to do stuff to materially change it or to address the harms that it's had on certain people. And so when people make arguments about, oh, it's going to get commodified, it's just like, okay, but why are you mad? Like, I don't get it. Like, yeah, that commodification is going to happen through all elements of life. We live in a capitalist society that makes it so that neoliberalism and other things that commodify all the time. But it doesn't mean that that's not worth the risk of still struggling against those things. So yeah.
Perfect. Also, my second question is, how would KF respond to like arguments such as like, oh, X author is like problematic or sexist?
So first off, you need to research your author
Yeah.
and make sure that they're not that. But the other thing too is that you can get people who are writing in the tradition of that author, maybe not use the original context of that author, because you can't really hold a person academically responsible for something that another author has said, even though we're writing in tradition of them. Like, for example, there are people that, say Heidegger is a Nazi, right? But at the end of the day, do you criticize and hold the person accountable that utilizes Heideggerian thought to make arguments that are progressive, right? Like, do you do that? Like, it's just like, why should they be held accountable for what that author did? And that also assumes that the arguments that that author is making are never valid when they possibly could be. Because a lot of Heidegger's arguments about environmental managerialism are something that are definitely used a lot, and they're pretty good arguments, to be honest.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome, yes.
You know what the argument about like reparations for black people using MBI or just using like child abuse, child reparations? You said you wouldn't like, you don't think that's a good argument, right?
No, I'm saying that reparations really doesn't fully have a place in this topic in the sense of it being legitimately ran as an affirmative topic. Because the topic literally is crafting stuff around that. Like basic income is definitely not something that's reparations. Jobs guarantee is not that because we're required to work. And also Social Security is like, that's not gonna be a thing. So I think that if teams wanna read a reparations argument, it would definitely be against the topic. And if you demand reparations for black people as a thing that we should invest our knowledge production into, that's a good ask to make. Just know that it's just not topical based on what the resolution says. I mean, I think also in a negative, you can make arguments of reparations too. It's just like, Social Security, definitely for a very, 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 very long time has excluded black people. And it's still doing it in a way because, there's certain things like your incarceration based on certain crimes have made it so that you don't really get access to that or not even be in the job market for that matter. There's a lot of structural issues to reasons why black people may not be able to get access to the full credit and benefit of things like Social Security or jobs guarantee.
My biggest like conflict with the whole reparations argument is like, what do you classify as a black person? Their DNA, what they look like? Because there's plenty of white passing people who have African DNA. So it was more like, how would they classify a person as black?
Yeah, so I cut a card on this. I can provide it to you later, but it was under the app that you ran, Curtis.
Reparations off?
Yeah. So it was like. It was talking about DNA testing. It was also talking about, like, even if you are a mixed black person, it's based on the degree in which you are mixed. So it's like, you would get reparations not just for slavery, but because of policies of Jim Crow and things like housing discrimination and job discrimination, things of that nature. But it's just like, for example, I think the card used Obama as an example to say that Obama would get some level of reparations because of the fact that his father is, what he is, but his mom doesn't really make him qualify for full benefits of reparations, but there could be policies that have created a structure that made it harder for him to exist in the world based on all the other material stuff. So that's what he would get reparations for. But then they said the same thing about Kamala Harris. It's like that would be the same instance for her. But we look at Michelle Obama, she has, two black parents that come from a lineage that could have been affected by not only Jim Crow, but also enslavement. So that would be a thing. But there's a lot of like equations of how to come up with that. And even for people to jump to that question, to say who was black, is trying to discount the whole idea of people getting reparations in the first place. Because it's just like, when we think about indigenous folks, and when they're getting like, some form of reparative things from the government, that use of blood quantums is something that they definitely stopped. And I think one of the Cherokee Supreme Court ruled that out because what happened is that one of the indigenous groups, they expelled all their black members, right? And it was really messed up. But I think that Supreme Court overturned that, and now they started to recognize as black members. So that's the thing. It's like that becomes a very iffy topic, but it also becomes an alibi for people to say, "Oh, we don't know who's black, so we shouldn't get reparations." It's like, yeah, it's a bit of a cop out. So they could do time to invest in who is black or who has lineage within that situation. Yes.
Like as the neg, how do you engage with like performance pieces and apps?
So sometimes what you can do is have a counter performance if that's what you want to do, or you can say that the performance was bad, or you can pick out of something in the performance to say like your representation of X was bad, right? Or you can just read framework too. That could be a thing. But there's definitely case arguments that people can make about performative things that people do, or where the performance comes from. Because oftentimes people are not making original performances. Sometimes they're taking it from other people, and like you can probably criticize the connection to that. The other thing too is if you have a copy of their stuff, you can kind of run it through Google and see if there's like keywords in there that you can criticize or say are bad, or what is the implication of the way that they've delivered a particular message, or who could it excluded, or things like that. Because sometimes it does, and sometimes people say offensive things in their performance, or even in their lane acknowledgments, and they get punished for them. Yes.
If you were to talk or advocate for the UBI plus income thing, how do you like support that to a judge saying, "Oh, we're giving black people more money as like an apology or as like a makeup for slavery"?
I think that you might want to say this is a beginning process to a structural redistribution of those things, but you don't want to say that it is the end of it. Like we just give that and it's just like, that's it, right? I think that more so, I don't think I got to talk about this, but you can say that this is a starting point of how we can start to create a system where reparations has a condition to be met in some form or fashion. So I think that in a very policy-based way, that could be one of the ways in which we start to address reparations. But for any of y'all that actually are going to try to engage in arguments about reparations, you definitely want to do a whole lot of research and look at the history of like what has been going on with reparations, what states have started to initiate bills for that, and historically who has been trying to push a bill in Congress to do that forever. Because there's a lot of conversation about it. And there's also different ways in which reparations can be configured, and it's not just like cash handouts. It's also like land, education grants, loan forgiveness, infrastructure projects, community banks, all types of stuff. So just don't think about reparations as like, hey, let's give these black people a check and they'll be good. No, that's not it. So yeah. Yes.
For the performance, where would it go, like in your case?
Sometimes people put it at the top. Sometimes people work it in the in-between statements of within the affirmative or in-between evidence, right? It's pretty much however you want to do it. I would not save it for the end because that's a bit different. But like usually people put it at the top, or they have it at the top and they start to do it in and out of their speech. Yes.
Performances can also be multimodal, so they can be like poetry in the beginning and music throughout your speech, or it can be like music and pictures within the document that you send out. So it can take on many different shapes and doesn't have to be one-dimensional, which also alters the way you can provide like explanation of your topic and analysis.
Yes, very, very true. Anybody else? Yes.
Do you think this year would be a good year to run like a critical affirmative on like the oppression of neurodivergent individuals like in society?
Yes, under the jobs portion, I would think is probably the most relevant part. But Social Security is definitely an aspect as well. I'm not 100% sure how basic income interacts, but I think those other two are very potent ways that it can be a thing.
Alright, so I was thinking about doing that because I'm neurodivergent.
Yes, 100%. And you should look at some of the history of how Social Security and even just like employment discrimination has had an effect on that, as well as educational opportunity. But yes, any other questions? No? Okay, cool, thank you. Jason, what are you doing now? Can you go back to lab?
I think so.
I wanted to say thank you. I'm a poet as well as a filmmaker, so that's very because I've
I know you can do it, but you just gotta have like strategic ways to do it. So you're saying that they have the same so you were just talking about how you have